Hello, it's Stephanie here, and today we're going to be looking at some embroidery techniques. We're going to look at running stitch, back stitch and satin stitch. And I've done a little bit of work on cross stitch, whip stitch and blanket stitch as well. I've got a knot on my thread and I'm using 6 strands of embroidery floss. So basically you can make a running stitch any size that you want. You come up and you go down, and it's as simple as that. Now it's your choice where you place the next stitch. I'm making this one quite close to the first stitch. It's your choice how long you make each stitch, and that can make running stitch really versatile. It can do a lot of different things. I've made a huge gap between this next stitch, and then I'm going to place a few going up in a bit of a circle. It's ever so versatile, and depending on the gaps and the stitches, I've sped up a bit here, I can't actually sew this quickly, but depending on how many gaps you leave or how long you do your stitches gives the look of your work a really different feel, and you can get different effects, and I'll show you some of the different things that running stitch can look like in a moment. When you've finished, of course, make sure that you take your thread to the back of your work and knot it off. I do suggest putting a tiny blob of glue if you don't feel that your knots are secure enough. There, I've done a circle in this instance. If I wanted to, I could applique on using a running stitch, and this is a real contrast. Any bit of fabric I like in any shape. Here I've done another sample specifically for a running stitch. If you want to, you can measure the dots with a ruler before you start sewing and play with the different gaps. I've got 1/2 centimetre gaps and 1/2 centimetre stitches, and then I've got really long gaps in orange, and then I've done a freeform with any gap and any length. It depends on the look that you're going for. I'll show you a contrast thread here of sewing, but also if you used an ordinary thin sewing thread, it can look almost invisible. Here's the same thing from far away. You wouldn't really notice the stitches. This is meant to be visible, and I've actually cut around the denim so that it will fray. Now this is my favourite thing to do with running stitch. Write anything you like and it can go around corners really nicely. For the other side, I do like to tie a knot. Not everybody does, and other people weave through their work as much as they can, but I am a knot tier. And so what I want you to do is to make a circle at the back and then pull through the hoop that you've made. I tend to always do 2 knots, I don't do more than 2. And then you know that you're quite secure. Now the important thing is when you bring the scissors in and cut it off, don't cut it really close to the knot. Leave a little bit. And then I've got a little tail on there, and it just gives the knot a little bit of wiggle room. If it does start to undo, then your work won't come out. You can put a blob of glue if you'd like to. Now the next thing we're going to move on to is back stitch. It's very similar to running stitch, but back stitch can be highly decorative. It can be a little bit of a thicker stitch. There are no gaps in between it. And as you can see, we come up in exactly the same way. Pick your stitch length. I'm doing, what would you say, 1/2 centimetre? 1/4 inch, that kind of size. And then you decide where you come up, but make it about the same distance at the back. And instead of going forwards like running stitch, go backwards. So that would be a running stitch, but this way you go backwards and you fill in the gap. So back stitch is funny. You go backwards and then you go forwards again behind the work. Now I don't turn the work over, just trust that your brain knows where the needle's going to be. I see a lot of people turning the work over, and it's not very useful to do that. Just have the needle behind the work, choosing where to go. And so can you see, you make a stitch that hasn't got any gaps in it. Back stitch is actually used by hand sewers for doing seams. It's a very strong stitch. You've got a lot of the thread behind and a lot of the thread in the front. And just like running stitch, you can make any shapes you like. I've sped this up a bit here. I do enjoy my sewing, but you don't want to watch all of it. There's another way to do back stitch, which your mother probably has taught you. And instead of stabbing up and then down, you keep your top hand on top and poke through to the next stitch length. I don't always get a very even stitch length doing it this way, but it is much, much quicker. Although I have sped this up, so you might not go as quickly as I am. Just want to show you that the back stitch on the top has got no gaps, and just compare that with quite a neat looking running stitch, which always does have gaps, so it gives you a different look. I recently completed just a little bit of embroidery. This is all done with back stitch, and I just have this at the entrance of my sewing room. So now we move on to looking at 2 stitches which help you to applique on a piece of fabric. I'm using quite a few pins. They seem like too many, but I don't like my fabric to move, and I'll be removing them as we go along. I'm going to use embroidery floss with 6 strands and a knot at the back so that you can see my work. If you wanted this to be invisible, you would need to use a white thread, and just a thin sewing thread would make this nearly invisible. Now, a whip stitch, if you can imagine, just goes round and round and round. It doesn't really change direction. And as a consequence of that, you will always see the little bars of thread on the top of the patch or piece of applique that you're doing. I tend to use this stitch for sewing on scout badges and brownie badges and the like. And this is how I sew them on quite neatly. Whip stitch is really, really easy. It can give a decorative look, but blanket stitch is one of my favourites. Now, I think I do my blanket stitch upside down to a lot of people, so if you look at a different tutorial, if this one doesn't suit you, that's absolutely fine. But blanket stitch, you go through and then wrap. Well, you can see what I'm doing quite clearly. So I go into the applique fabric and out on the very edge where the 2 fabrics meet, and then I wrap around before I pull through. Beautiful people that do beautiful blanket stitch make their stitches very, very regular. And this is quite a decorative stitch that you'll probably see, so make a feature of it. Here's an owl that one of my daughters drew, and my friend Katie put it onto a fabric design. This is actually the front of a t-shirt for a little girl from a few years ago, but Katie's blanket stitches are absolutely beautifully close together. So we're moving on to satin stitch, which is a really good way of creating anything you can draw. It's a bit like colouring in with thread. What I would suggest if you were using a lighter colour background fabric is to draw your underlying colour with a permanent marker pen first, so I'd use yellow on this, and then if you don't quite cover all of the area that you want, you won't notice as much because it will be covered by that underlying colour. As you can see, you're trying to get the stitches as close together as possible. It's a really good look, a satin stitch. I'll just show you here, it depends which direction you want to go. The L I've gone north to south, the O I've gone east to west, and the V I have regulated which way I go. This I did many years ago, and you can see I've gone across. So you get a different look with different designs. Moving on to cross stitch. Lots of you will do counted cross stitch. That's where you use 2 bits of embroidery thread and you make a very careful pattern in line with a design that you have probably purchased a kit altogether. But this is a freeform kind of cross stitch. All you're trying to do is to draw a cross. Now, what I find is when I do cross stitch freeform without any guides, all of my stitches are different shapes and sizes, and what I would suggest is if that's the way it's going to be, then why don't you use that as a design feature? What I try and do, this is where you do counted cross stitch, you do all of the stitches in a row, you do the under going in a forward slash direction, and then all of the stitches coming back. But I find that quite hard to do when you are embroidering on a freeform bit of fabric like this. What I'll do is I'll show you a sample I've made, which I call Wild and Free. The outside I've tried to make a very distinct love heart shape, but the inside, all different sizes of cross have been used, but all together it's a really good look. So it's a great way of covering a large amount of fabric and uses a lot less thread than satin stitch. I'll show you how to do counted cross stitch. Just get some graph paper or squared paper, make your own design. And then I would suggest, if you happen to have it, using some cross stitch material, put it down onto your background material and cross stitch through both of them together, following the pattern that you've made on your graph or your squared paper. And then when you've finished, get some tweezers, or you can use your fingers, and just pull out the cross stitch material. That's going to be ruined, it's not going to be able to use it again, but this is a way to get a really defined cross stitch pattern on something maybe like a t-shirt, a moving around fabric. It's quite a good technique to know, and I'll show you that I've done the smaller love heart underneath in that way. So, thank you so much for watching, and now it's your time to sew.